Shalom everyone, hope everyone's doing well. Bezat Hashem, today we are going to learn Yudchet Amud Bet in Masechet Sanhedrin 18b. And we're going to start the top of Yudchet Amud Bet, the 4 lines from the top of the page. We're going to have 2 sections in today's learning. The first section we will deal with is really wrapping up the Over aseh and lo taaseh of the Kohen Gadol we mentioned in the Braita at the end of the day yesterday, as well as what it means the Kohen Gadol is allowed to testify. We'll learn exactly what the situation is for his allowance. And the second section we'll get into is a new halacha regarding a king on the Sanhedrin and a king in Kohen Gadol in terms of Ibur Shana. Bezat Hashem, we'll see the reasons for that as well. As always, our learning should be as a zechut, a merit for Refuah Shlema for Yaakov ben Dinah. He should have a speedy, quick, and full recovery, and we should only hear Bisarot Tovot. Bezat Hashem, let's get started. We had said in the Braita at the end of the day yesterday, towards the bottom of Yudchet Amud Aleph, that if a Kohen Gadol kills somebody, we said if he kills b'mezid, he's killed. If he kills intentionally, so he's put to death. If he kills b'shogeg unintentionally, golet, so he's sent into exile. We said that was the chidush where we said daninoto, that you could judge the Kohen Gadol. We went through the chidush yesterday. But then the Braita said, ve'over al aseh ve'al taaseh. The Kohen Gadol transgresses an aseh and a lo taaseh. And then the Braita finishes off, areyu kehedjot l'chol dvarav. He's like a ordinary person in every way. So the Gemara focuses on that second to last statement. We look at it as 2 different statements. And what does it mean that he's over an aseh? He transgresses aseh and lo taaseh. What is that referring to? So the Gemara says, over al aseh va lo taaseh. The implication of the Braita is he's forced, he's almost compelled to transgress an aseh and a lo taaseh. I mean, what does that mean? Kohen Gadol has to transgress positive and negative commands? Lo sagi de lo avar, is he not able to not transgress? So the Gemara answers, no, the way you have to read the Braita is it goes together with the last statement. Hachika amar, im avar laseh ve'al lo taaseh. If the Kohen Gadol transgresses a positive or negative command, now a positive command for normal people, if a person's transgressing a positive command, Beit Din was allowed to hit them with makat mardut. They would be allowed to deal with them, beat them up so that they keep the positive command. And similarly with a lo taaseh, if a person transgresses a lo taaseh, so in a court they would give him malkot. So in that regard, areyu kehedjot, he's like an ordinary person. He'll also receive adjudication in these regards by a court of 3, l'chol dvarav, in all ways, meaning that if he transgresses an aseh or a lo taaseh, he'll get punished by a court of 3 like an ordinary person. So the Gemara says, pshita, it seems obvious. What's the chidush in that? Sal kadata chamina, you may have thought to say, since we learned in the first Mishnah in the Masechet, beginning of the first parak, we learned ein danin lo et hashevet. We learned that when it comes to the adjudication of a shevet, we give different examples what that refers to. V'lo et navi sheker, nor a false prophet. V'lo et Kohen Gadol, we know that a Kohen Gadol, el al pi beit din shel shiv'im ve'echad. So when it comes to capital punishments of these 3 categories, shevet, navi sheker, and Kohen Gadol, the only adjudication can be taken place in a court of 71. V'amar Rav Ada bar Ahav, and Rav Ada bar Ahav said, why is that true by Kohen Gadol? Because we deduce from the pasuk where Yitro tells Moshe, Kol hadavar hagadol yaviu elecha, all of the great things shall be brought to you. It doesn't mean the serious matters, like the other shita held there, but rather dvarav shel gadol. It means the matters of the great one, meaning the Kohen Gadol, his cases need to be adjudicated by Moshe Rabbeinu, who is reminiscent or representative of the court of 71. So you might say, since it says kol hadavar hagadol, ema kol dvarav shel gadol, we had a hava aminah like this as well. So you might say it means all matters of the Kohen Gadol, meaning even his lower non-capital punishments are adjudicated by a court of 71. So Kamash Malan, therefore the Braita says that he's like a hedjot, meaning regarding aseh and lo taaseh, which is non-capital type punishment, that would be in a court of 3 like a normal person. Asks the Gemara, well, maybe that's true. Maybe we should deduce from the verse, Kol dvarav shel gadol, and really even his non-capital punishments are adjudicated in a court of 71. So the Gemara answers, even though the way we're learning the pasuk, this is a bit of a chidush on what we learned before. Even though the way Rav Ada bar Ahav explained the pasuk, which was like the second Braita, if you remember, in that sugya, on Tet Zayin Amud Aleph, we spoke about this. Even though we're learning, it doesn't mean that means davar gadol, a serious matter, but rather it means dvarav shel gadol. But really, the simple pshat, as we're about to deduce from the verse, is it means more serious matters. Because michtiv, says the Gemara, does it say divrei gadol, which would mean matters of the great one? Doesn't say that outright. Rather, hadavar gadol chdiv. It says the matters hagadol, which means of the great one, but it means also serious ones. Which means davar gadol mamash. It means literally, to be understood also literally, the more serious matters of the Kohen Gadol. So therefore, if it talks about capital punishments, it would need to be dealt with for a Kohen Gadol in a court of 71. But non-capital would not be dealt with in a court of 71. Rather, you'd have the lower courts, 3, and that would be sufficient. That's the chidush of the Braita. Okay. It's very interesting because the way we're learning now is that the pasuk really has dual implication, and it only means the serious matters of the Kohen Gadol, not general matters. That's the way we know it's not also inclusive of his non-capital types of averot. Okay, let's continue on now. So that until now we discussed the idea of a Kohen Gadol judging and being judged by others. Now we move on to that second part of that at the beginning of the Mishnah, which was me'idu me'idinoto. We said a Kohen Gadol can me'id, he can testify, and also people can testify about him. So the Gemara asks the following question. It says like this. In general, the process of being a witness in court, it's to some degree lowering, disgraceful. Right? The court hyper-analyzes you. You have to testify in front of everybody. And the Gemara's question, therefore, is going to be, which will prove a source for this, is that if the Kohen Gadol, we're worried about his honor, it doesn't seem appropriate, actually, that he should be allowed to testify, at least in a normal situation. So what is the case of the Mishnah that the Kohen Gadol is allowed to be a regular witness, which in general seems to be below his dignity? Says the Gemara, Me'id, is he allowed to testify? V'atanya, we have a Braita that says as follows. Now there's a mitzvah in the Torah of Hashavat Aveidah. Hashavat Aveidah means if you see someone's lost object, you have a mitzvah to return it. But the Torah says like this. It says, when you see his lost object, v'hitalamta, you should not cast your eyes aside, meaning don't avoid it, rather return it. And then it says another emphasis of lo tuchal italem, you should not look away. So what we deduce from this is, v'hitalamta, we learn actually not kipshuto, which is there are times you are allowed to look away. There are times that a person, as we'll see, for certain situations, is allowed to not return the item even though he sees somebody's lost item. And one of the reasons we're going to say is if it's beneath his dignity. And that's going to be the kasha. Tanya says the Braita, v'hitalamta, it says you can turn away. That's the way we're darshaning. Pa'amim she'ata mitalem, there are times you could turn away, you can cover your eyes. U'pa'amim she'ata mitalem, and there are times you're not allowed to. Okay, it said, how is it? Kohen v'hu b'veit hakfarot, if a kohen is walking by a cemetery, and he sees someone's lost object in a cemetery. Now, he has an isur to become tameh, so he would turn away. Zaken ve'ena lefi chvodo. Similarly, if you have an older person, a respected individual, and it's not honorable for him to go around with this. Rashi says, if it was his own item, he wouldn't want to go retrieve it, because it would be disrespectful for him, as it's not a significant item. This is an interesting example. A person has a very high-paying job. Now, if he takes off from his job, where he makes $10,000 an hour, to go retrieve somebody's item and return it to him, that fellow who he returns the item to is going to have to pay him back for his loss of work. The item is not worth much, so it's not worth it for the recipient of this item to have to pay back that amount of money. So in all these cases, lakach ne'amar v'hitalamta. That's why it says you could avoid it. It means you could turn away. There are times you're allowed to, but one of these reasons is because not lefi chvodo. So similarly, asks the Gemara, if it's not respectful for a kohen, respectful for the kohen himself to testify, what does the Mishnah mean when it says he could be me'id? So Amar Rav Yosef says, no, it's a particular case we're talking about. Me'id lemelech. If there's a case where the king is a litigant, the Kohen Gadol is allowed to testify, because there already, it is considered in his honor to testify. He's not testifying about a regular person. He's testifying about the king. That's what the Mishnah means when it says Me'id. The Gemara says, but that doesn't work with our Mishnah, because Vatsanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Lo dan velo daninoto, that a king cannot judge, nor could he be judged about. He can't be a litigant in a court case. So the Gemara says, how could the Kohen Gadol testify about the king if he's not allowed to be adjudicated on in a court case? Lo me'id v'lo me'idinoto. Excuse me, I skipped a step, got excited. Is that he's not allowed to judge, he's not allowed to be judged on, and also he's not allowed to testify, nor is he allowed to be testified about. So if he's not allowed to be testified about, how can you tell me the Kohen Gadol is testifying about the king? Elam Rabbi Zeres says a different pshat. He says, Me'id leben melech. Really, the Kohen Gadol could testify. Who is he going to testify? Not about the king, because he can't be testified against or about, but rather he can testify for the son of the king. So the Gemara says that would be considered respect. The Gemara says it's not acceptable, because ben melech hedyotu. He's not the king. So how can he testify about the son of the king? That's already back to the original question. Is this disrespectful for the Kohen Gadol to testify about the son of the king? He's like an ordinary person. He's a commoner. Ben melech hedyotu. So Ella, the Gemara says, rather, what's the pshat? Who could he testify? Me'id bifnei hamelech. A unique scenario. This is how Rashi learns. Sorry, before we get there. What it means is, if the king is a judge on the court, the Kohen Gadol is allowed to testify, because that's within his honor to do, so long as the king is a judge. The problem is, V'hayin moshivin melech b'Sanhedrin. We know, I already said, king can't be part of the Sanhedrin. We'll mention it later in a moment, and we'll say the reasonings. So it can't be that that's the answer, because the king cannot be part of the Sanhedrin. So the Gemara answers, finally, the pshat is like this. Now, the way that Rashi explains is this actually going back to the original answer. Really, we're talking about a case where the son of the king is a litigant in a court case. So what's going to happen is the Kohen Gadol is going to come testify. He knows information about the son of the king. But usually it wouldn't be lefich vodo, according to his honor, for him to testify even for the son of the king, as he's like a commoner. But mishum yikara de Kohen Gadol, in honor of the Kohen Gadol, ata v'ativ, the king himself will come and sit, not as a judge, but just as to be there to give honor to the Kohen Gadol when he testifies about the son of the Kohen Gadol, of the king, who's the litigant in this case. Right. Fine. Then the court will accept the testimony of the Kohen Gadol, again in the presence of the king, so it's not demeaning for the Kohen Gadol. Then the king will get up and leave. And then after the king leaves, we will analyze exactly the judgment on this case. So the point is that it's a very particular scenario. The way Rashi explains it is, in a scenario where the son of the king is being judged, which is acceptable, the king will sit in if the one who's testifying about his son is the Kohen Gadol, in order to give honor to the Kohen Gadol, and it's not demeaning for the Kohen Gadol to testify. And in such a scenario, he'll testify, the king will leave, then we'll analyze exactly what the outcome of this case will be, and that's the particular case of Me'id, where a Kohen Gadol can testify. Now, Gufa, we had just said, and we'll analyze this now. Ein moshivin melech b'Sanhedrin. A king is not allowed to be a member of the Sanhedrin. Velo melech v'kohen gadol be'ibur shana. And as we spent a lot of time in the first parak discussing, there were times that the Chachamim would intercalate the year, adding an extra Adar, but a king and Kohen Gadol cannot be on that court in regards to adding that extra month. So the Gemara says, let's go through this brighter. Let's understand this. Melech b'Sanhedrin. I understand why a king can't be part of the Sanhedrin. Dichtiv, because the pasuk tells us regarding judgment, it says lo ta'ana al riv. Now, literally, it means you shall not answer al riv when there's a dispute. But the way we expound the pasuk is lo ta'aneh al rav. You cannot argue against rav, against the master. Which means, actually, we deduce from this later in the Masechta that when there was judgment going on, the first judge to give his pisuk din, his psak din, what he thought should not be the head of the Sanhedrin, the Av Beit Din. And why shouldn't it be? Because once he gives his determination, no one else is allowed to argue on him. So therefore, he actually would give his conclusion last after everybody else give, and other ones would have the capacity to voice alternative opinions. But in a similar vein, the reason that the king can't be on the Sanhedrin is because if he would forcibly have to give his opinion first because of his kavod as being the king. But then nobody would be allowed to argue. So memela, it wouldn't be effective and proper to have him on the Sanhedrin. That I understand. So lo melech v'kohen gadol b'ibur shana. The second part of the statement was that the king and kohen gadol are not allowed to be on the court to intercalate the year. So why is this? So the Gemara says very interesting, because we would suspect, we know they're not going to do things inappropriately, but maybe there will be a suspicion or a observation that people might think they have a certain interest in ibur shana. And actually it's opposite. Melech, the king, would have an interest in promoting ibur shana, in adding an extra month. Why? Mishum afsanya, because of the wages of his army. Rashi explains the king was responsible to pay his army, and he paid once a year. So he would prefer to add a 13th month onto the year so that he doesn't have to pay them more, because now that you have more months in 1 year, he ends up having to pay less. Now this might be a way people would interpret the ibur shana, so therefore we don't have a king on a court to make ibur shana. Now kohen gadol, what's the reason kohen gadol can't be on ibur shana either, on that type of a court? Mishum tzina. It's a very interesting reasoning. We know on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol had a very extensive avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. We actually go through it in the Tefillah. It's one of the reasons we have a lengthy Tefillah on Yom Kippur. But part of the service on Yom Kippur, he would go to the mikveh 5 times, and he would wash his hands and feet also 10 times. So this was a process that involved a lot of water. Now, when you make a leap year, as we're going to understand now, the way I'll explain like Tosafot explains, if you make a leap year not to realign the seasons, but rather for another reason, which means we spoke in the first parak about many reasons why you might add an extra month. One of them would be to realign the seasons. It means we want Pesach to be in the spring, we want Tishrei or Sukkot to be in the fall or the autumn, right? But there's other reasons also, not necessarily to realign, which means the months and the Chagim are lined up with the seasons, but there's other reasons you'd also have to make a leap year we discussed in the first parak. Now, if you make a leap year for those other reasons, what's going to happen is Tishrei is going to be pushed from the autumn into the winter. Now, the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur was covered in water a lot. He was going to the mikveh, washing his hands and feet. If it's the winter, he's going to be cold. So there's a suspicion that he might avoid making a leap year to keep Tishrei and thereby Yom Kippur in the autumn, in the warmer season, not yet in the winter where it would be colder for him. So for this reason, we're not going to allow a king to be on that court to intercalate the year, nor a Kohen Gadol to be on that court to intercalate the year. Now, I want to speak this next piece out. Mishum tzinas, it's because of the cold. I want to speak this next piece out before we see it inside. It's a little bit confusing. What we just said was that there's a suspicion if the Kohen Gadol would be on the court to intercalate the year, add the extra month, he'd be motivated with an interest to not intercalate the year. Because if he would, it would push off Tishrei and thereby Yom Kippur to what would have been Tishrei to now be in Cheshvan, which is the next month, and Cheshvan has colder weather. So the Gemara says, and then it would be uncomfortable for him. So the Gemara says from this it would seem to imply, it's a little bit difficult, but the Gemara says from this it would seem to imply that when you make a leap year, the weather of the coming year is determined not in the month that it falls now, but rather in the month that it should have fallen before a leap year was created, i.e., when you intercalate the year, what will be Tishrei next year will feel like the cold of Cheshvan and not the warmer feeling, the warmer weather of Tishrei. So it seems that the weather, the seasons, will follow what would have been, meaning it would have been Cheshvan, and not what it is, Tachlis, which is Tishrei. This is going to be challenged from a story that we'll see in a minute. So Amar Papa says, it seems to be a very logical thing, but let's see. Amar Papa, Shema Mina, from this we hear, Shata, the weather of the year, Batar Yarcha Azil. It will follow the month that it should have fallen out in, not what it is based on the intercalation. Which means it should have been Cheshvan, and therefore it's going to have the cold weather of Cheshvan, not the Tishrei weather, which would be warmer, because Tachlis, even though it is Tishrei now, it would have been Cheshvan. Eini, is that true? We're going to show a story that seems to imply when they would add an extra month, actually, it would realign itself. So the Gemara says, and then it would actually be that the months would have the weather that are appropriate for that month, not what would have been. Heini, is that true? V'hanach gimel roi bakar. There were these 3 shepherds of cattle, herdsmen. The Havukaimi, they were standing. V'sham inu rabbanan de ka'amri. The rabbis overheard these 3 shepherds talking. Chad Amar, now one of the shepherds said, Im bachir v'lakish kechada, if the early produce, which is wheat, and the late produce, which is barley, kachada yinatz, they sprout at the same time, Denahu Adar. So you know that it's the warmth of the year that's beginning to warm up. That's the end. Adar, which we're in right now, actually. In Miami, we can't feel this so much. I guess in LA, you don't feel it too much either. But where there's 4 seasons, I guess in LA you do have. But where there's 4 seasons, Adar, it already starts to warm up. It's close. It's getting closer to the spring. So when the early and late grains, means the wheat and the barley, are already sprouting together, Deinu Adar. So you know that that's already Adar. V'im lav, but if not, meaning it's still colder, it's still earlier in the year, let Dein Adar. So this is not Adar, rather it's still Shvat, because it's the month before, it's colder, the produce hasn't all sprouted like it would if it was Adar. That's one shepherd, he said. Another shepherd said, Im tor bitzfar beteleg yamut. If in the morning the tor is the shore, beteleg yamut, almost dies because of the cold. So expression, obviously. Uvetiara, and in the afternoon, betul te'ena yidmuch, and in the afternoon, in the shade of the fig tree, it dozes. Yishlach mashche, and it scratches off its skin. 1 second. Yeah, Rashi explains, right. And in the afternoon of the same day, he dozes in the shade because of the heat of the sun. Means it got very hot from the cold of the morning to the heat of the afternoon, that he dozes in the shade and he wants to scratch off his skin on the tree, meaning it's so hot that he wants to take off his skin. The point is, it's very cold in the morning and it's very hot in the afternoon. Deinu Adar, so you know already it's Adar. V'im lav, let Dein Adar. And if not, it's still cold, bichlal, more cold, it's still Shvat. And the third one said, Im kidum takif lachadayehe, if the eastern wind is especially powerful, especially cold, and yipach beloach nafik lekivle, but if you blow out hot air from your mouth, it goes out to greet it, meaning even though there's cold wind blowing strongly, if you blow out hot air, it'll overcome that, meaning it's not so cold. Dein hu Adar, you know that's Adar. V'im lav, but if it's colder than that, let Dein Adar, you know it's not yet Adar, it's still Shvat. Now, what the shepherds seem to have been saying is that this year, even though next month is supposed to be Nisan, it would appear that it's so cold that it still feels like this is not yet, this is really more like Adar Sheni, there should be an extra month. They were implying that there should be a leap year. And the Gemara says, the story goes, V'ivru Rabbanan la'ishata. The rabbis intercalated the year. Now, the point is it would appear from the story that the rabbis were relying on the herdsmen, and they were using this cheshbon, which is, we'll add an extra month to realign the seasons, which means Adar Sheni would actually have this type of a description of weather like Adar should have, not like Nisan should have. So the kasha the Gemara is saying is, you see seemingly, when you add the extra month, it's a little bit of a difficult sugya, but you add the extra month, it doesn't make it that the weather of that extra month will reflect what should have been without the intercalation, but rather it reflects what that month really should be, i.e. it has the month of Adar's weather as it's meant to be. So this challenges our assumption before. The Gemara refutes this and says, not a proof. V'tizbra, is that logical? Rabbanan avata samuch, are they going to rely on herdsmen? Meaning, since when do herdsmen, the farmers, make decisions for leap years? El Rabbanan achushbanayu samuch. The rabbis relied on their own calculations. V'roi bakar, and the shepherds, istayu ihud istayaya miltayu. They supported or corroborated the words of the rabbis, meaning the rabbis had their own cheshbon in terms of why they intercalated the year. Actually, the way that the Rishonim explained, we would add in over here, they intercalated the year to realign the seasons, meaning actually they saw that the seasons aren't going to line up, and in which case, when you add that extra month, the Adar will have weather that Adar really should have because it realigns the seasons. So therefore, they had their cheshbon. Happens to be that these shepherds corroborated their words, but that wasn't what they relied on. As opposed to earlier, what we were talking, as Tosafot explains, if they would make a leap year when the seasons are already aligned properly, so then you'll actually have weather in the seasons that will be after that would reflect what it would have been without the intercalation, i.e. in the Tishrei that follows, it'll be cold like Cheshvan because you're going out of season for whatever reasons that are necessary to do that, and that's the example of the Kohen Gadol being on the court to intercalate. We're going to stop here, the bottom of Yudchet Amud Bet, Choletz V'Chotzim. We'll pick up tomorrow with that, and Yutet Amud Aleph, and in the meantime, everybody have a wonderful day.